Hi everyone, my name is Will White and welcome to the FinTech Insider On Air episode 34. Thank you so much for joining us last week. We had a bunch of people live and even more watching afterwards, so thank you so much for all the support. Last week David talked to Laurel Quinn about FinTech for Good. It was a really great episode, so go check it out on his Periscope or on the 11FS YouTube. This week we're going to talk about the FCA Techsprint and the proposed cross-sector Sandbox. Joining me today is Samantha Emery, Innovate Head of Department at the FCA. Samantha, how are you today?
Yeah, really great. Thank you so much for having me on.
So can you tell us about your background and what you do at the FCA?
Yes, absolutely. So as mentioned, I'm the Head of Department at Innovate, and Innovate has a few functions. The first and the one that most people will probably be aware of is we actually provide firm-facing support services. So there are three strands to this. The first one is the Sandbox, which we're going to be expanding on a little bit more today. The second of which is actually the direct support service. So where firms have innovative ideas, but they want to understand how, where, if they touch the regulatory perimeter and what the requirements would be, they come to us at direct support. And importantly, it was actually the first service that was launched as part of Project Innovate 5 years ago. And last but not least, we have the advice unit, which is set up specifically around firms that are looking at bringing robo-advisory services to the market. So those are the firm support services, and then we have two other areas. The first one is pretty key for us as a regulator, and that's the innovation policy. So we are there to make sure we're keeping a line of sight on what's going on in the marketplace, understand if any gaps appear around policy, and how best and how most proportionately we can actually respond to those. And then the third and final piece of what we do in Innovate is actually leading the charge for the FCA on the domestic and international engagement programme relating to FinTech itself. So that's my role now, but when I actually came to the FCA, I came to actually set up another one of our startup departments, which was payments supervision. Prior to that, I was in industry, so I spent quite a lot of time working in the technology and transaction services space, looking at product development, product management, and a lot of work in the change and transformation arena. So quite a nice balance between traditional banking and fintech.
Nice. Okay. That was very impressive. You have to bear with me, it's my first one today, so I may stumble over a couple of things.
It's mine too. We'll just fight to see who does the first stumble and take it from there.
Cool. Well, with that in mind, firstly, what is the cross-sector Sandbox? I guess what's the sort of headline? What are you hoping this means for regulators, institutions and firms?
Yeah, absolutely. So ultimately, this is an area, a controlled environment where firms can actually test their innovative products and services live with consumers, but actually do so across different markets. And before I talk about that in any more detail, I think it's kind of important to talk to why a cross-sector sandbox. So when we started off this journey 5 years ago, as I mentioned, there were just a handful of people looking at how they could provide regulatory certainty for firms and give them a view on how they could engage with the financial services arena. About 2 years after that, so sort of 3 years ago, we actually launched the Sandbox, and I think it's fair to say it sort of captured the imagination both domestically and also internationally. And we've had about 300 requests for support over the duration of the Sandbox running. We were on our 5th cohort. We've accepted around 100 firms into test. And I think the key point in this for us is it's very difficult to have a name like Innovate and then not constantly be thinking about what you do next, what you do differently, how you can better support the market to bring about innovation in the interests of consumers. And so this is really part of the evolution journey for us. We've always talked about, our exec director in particular, Chris Willard, has spoken about the fact that we have oftentimes sort of been mirroring the journey of a startup that quite a lot of the firms that we engage with actually follow. And I think the sentiment still applies. It's just we're kind of edging into scale now. We're looking at what else there is we could do that builds off of what we already have as a strong service in the domestic financial services market. And an initial piece of this was the work that we started doing last year around GFIN, the Global Financial Innovation Network, and as well as that providing a regulatory community where we could sort of share knowledge, experience and trends, it also offered up the opportunity to trial out running a sandbox globally, so how we could support firms who wanted to come to the market and test solutions across different jurisdictions. And we kind of got to a point with that and thinking, well, actually, why would we not look to see if there was a need to do this in the UK, but actually across different sectors? And that's kind of how we got to this idea. We were lucky enough to get some funding from BEIS, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, through their Innovators Pioneer Fund, to actually do some analysis to see if there were demand for this idea. And that's how we've ended up here today.
Just on the international thing, the original FCA Sandbox, regulatory Sandbox, that's now been copied all over the world, right? I think we were the first. Were we the first globally, or am I just being overly patriotic there?
So,
I know it's been copied in like Arizona and all sorts of places now, but
yeah.
I know the FCA was very much ahead on that, right?
Yeah, I think it has been recognised that we have played a leading role in that space, and we think it is very important that we actually share the learnings and that we offer up across the regulatory community a forum in GFIN to actually sort of share that knowledge, share those learnings.
Cool. And what is in cross-sector, just to kind of clarify that, I've got a few other questions here, but
yeah, of course.
Cross-sector, is that kind of across different areas of financial services, or like how broad does it go? I'm just trying to...
So yes, this isn't just sort of looking at our sort of immediate regulatory family within financial services. This is going broader than that. So this is potentially across any of the regulators that we have within the UK. So people that we've been working with and talking to, for example, include the likes of Ofgem, Ofcom, Ofwat, right. The ICO, right. Even the Civil Aviation Authority. Wow. So it has been quite broad. And I think that's the best way of us actually determining if there is a need for this, cool. To allow all of those sort of regulators similar to ourselves to sort of tap into their networks and populations to determine that.
I guess that makes a lot of sense from sort of previous worlds, like obviously the ICO is the one I'm suddenly immediately thinking, of course that would make sense because everything's data rich. So why would financial services be, boxed away?
And that's it. A lot of the sort of technology and the drive towards data has put us in a space where ultimately those sort of quite clearly sort of delineated lines between the different regulators are a little bit more nuanced than they were before, and this provides potentially a good opportunity to actually work through some of the challenges that brings. So in terms of how might this be leveraged? Again, the call for input that's out at the moment, that closes on the 30th of August, that we're looking for feedback on, is the sort of venue where we're actually trying to see, can we get some good use cases, can we establish the demand? But just to give you a sense of what might be.
What date is that? Sorry, I just... What the call to action, what date is that?
So the call for input. So we basically, when we're looking at certain things and we're actually wanting to test the idea in the marketplace, we will often issue out a call for input, just to say, this is what we're thinking about, tell us your thoughts. So we have an email address, which is crosssectorsandbox@fca.org.uk. I'll repeat that again at the end. But you can find the call for input online. As I say, it closes in 2 days' time. So if anyone feels, based on what they hear today, that they have something to add to the conversation, some good ideas on potential use cases, barriers that exist, and whether or not this actually addresses them, we'd be really, really interested to hear from you.
Cool. I'm sure we can share a link or something.
Yeah, that would be really, really helpful.
I I don't want to. What's the overlap between the Civil Aviation Authority and FCA? I'm fascinated. I'm trying to think of that Venn diagram. I can see it, the ICO and the FCA, but
there are definitely more natural bedfellows than others. But
it's cool. But
the point is we're not determining on a need for it. We're opening up to see if there is. But looking at potential use cases, yes.
Makes sense.
Anything to do with things like digital ID, you could see sort of ourselves and the ICO obviously needing to work quite closely together. If you think about potentially financial services institutions wanting to get into things like energy tariff switching, that's where you get into the off-gem territory. But to go to the Civil Aviation Authority, I mean, middle of summer, we all know the drill. Everyone's sort of off going on holiday, and there inevitably are times. We had one sort of last year where it just goes awry, and planes are delayed, flights are cancelled, and you end up looking to your insurance policies. So things like, are there ways of actually getting sort of faster, more automated payouts of insurance policies by actually connecting directly into flight information? Those are possible tie-ins, but again, we're waiting to hear from everyone else.
Yeah, every summer there's always like an airline that goes down or last minute, and how can you tie that in? Oh yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense. That's cool. So what are the kind of key features of the regulatory sandbox? So what does that actually look like under the hood?
So I guess we've got a natural proxy in our sort of domestic financial services sandbox. So ultimately, this is a space that's a controlled environment for firms, be they new firms, incumbent firms, to come in and test in a controlled environment. So we are open for business with anyone that meets our criteria. I think there have been occasional sort of confusions as to whether we're just interested in new fintechs, whether there is sort of room at the table for larger incumbent organisations to get involved. That's very much not the case. If you meet the criteria, we consider your application. And again, that goes to where you're based. We're obviously based in Stratford, in London, but we do see an increasing number of applications from other regions in the UK, which is definitely something that we're looking to grow over time. So I mentioned kind of assessment criteria. We look at things like, I'm wondering what's going on over there and why I'm not involved in it. So we look at things like, is it truly an innovative idea? We have to be quite strict on that, because over the course of time, you may find that things become 10 a penny and actually they don't really fit in the sandbox anymore. We also look at whether there is benefit of the firm engaging with us. Is there value that we can bring to them? Which is quite important, and the headline in all of the criteria are the one point around consumer benefit. This is very much innovation in the interests of consumers, so you have to have a really strong consumer-driven story to make it in the door. So that's something that I'd see.
Just retail side, or also for like small and medium-sized businesses, or?
Yeah, all of the above. So
cool.
Everyone will have their respective consumer base, and oftentimes you'll find that even when you're sort of dealing B2B, at the end of it there is a C that will also benefit. So you can sort of extrapolate out through that. So that's the sort of criteria. We obviously work really hard to make sure we're sort of closely supervising and monitoring the firms when they come into the sandbox, that we have adequate safeguards around what they do to make sure that any consumers engaging with those firms are protected. And again, that's something that I would see being a feature of any sort of cross-sector sandbox. So I think the work that we've done in the UK and also internationally has given us quite a good straw man. But again, this would be something where we're working with the other regulators. So it's an opportunity for us to better what we've done previously and see where the future takes us.
Cool. And I suppose all of those regulators, I suppose maybe the ISO slightly, well, actually everyone is focused on protecting the consumer at the end of the day. Treating customers fairly.
Absolutely.
Treating customers fairly, ensuring that data is protected. So the more we can work together better. That's cool.
Yeah.
What
much.
challenges, do you see any potential challenges at this point, or?
I think, we've kind of touched on the fact that the number and the variety of different regulators that could potentially be a part of this. We do all have sort of, consumer protection and consumer interest at our hearts, but we do have slightly different mandates. We obviously have our own rule sets, and there would be certain, differences in the criteria that different regulators might want to set as entry criteria to the sandbox. And we have the same thing with our global sandbox in GFIN. The firms, it's incumbent on them to make sure they meet the entry requirements for the respective regulators. Right. We're not looking to harmonise through this. We're actually looking to create a practical sort of firm-facing arena to support the firms, also share the learnings, get more of a line of sight on cross-industry trends, things that might be kind of coming down the track. So I think there's definitely a degree of complexity there. And again, just when I go back to the fundamentals of the domestic financial services sandbox, which we started off with and still have today, there's very much something there around, it's not just getting into the sandbox. You may sort of get into the sandbox and we will work with you to see if we can get you to a point of testing, but not always is it the case that people make it through to that point of testing if we can't find the right kind of test, if we don't feel that we can do it in what would be sort of a safe and prudent way. So I think those challenges remain, and to an extent they do become amplified if you are working across regulators. And I think thirdly and finally, the major challenge is whether or not there is a need. So we have obviously asked the question as part of the call for input, do we think there's need for a cross-sector sandbox? But actually, when we look at the other services that we provide in the UK, like direct support, where we're talking about that sort of regulatory certainty and sort of advice around engaging with the perimeter, not everything requires a sandbox. So this may be a case in point where actually the market says to us, do you know what, we don't actually need this. What we need is something slightly different. It might be more about
guidelines, or
the dialogue, the way of engaging rather than the means of testing. And again, that's something that we're looking for kind of honest, constructive feedback on as part of the call for input.
Very cool. I think that's awesome. I look forward to seeing what happens next. I'm just going to move on to the next bit, which is the Techsprint.
Yes.
But before we do that, before we come on to the next questions, we have some stats, which I was going to go through. The UN estimates that there is at least 1.6 trillion is laundered through the global financial system each year. PwC reports that cybercrime is most commonly experienced form of fraud in the UK. I kind of question exactly what the definition of cybercrime is there. 48% of crimes reported in the last 2 years in the UK were cybercrimes. The Asset Recovery Action Plan will help bring back funds held by criminals. 1.6 billion was clawed back from criminals between 2010 and 2018, which seems like a fraction on the 1.6 trillion. And then the FCA held a Techsprint to develop new solutions on how to tackle financial crime. Separately, they're also proposing we've gone over that. What is the Techsprint and what purpose does it fill? And on this, David was there, I understand, judging recently, yes, and he sent me a message before this. He's really sorry. He's somewhere on a beach, like having fish and chips last scene. But he sent me a message saying, please let you know it was awesome and he loved it and it was incredible. So, and I'm super excited about this because under my remit previously was financial crime. It's a growing problem that I don't think people understand how complicated it is. You put more technology in, criminals will find ways to exploit it. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the what is a Techsprint? So I think the key thing here is ultimately this is something that's known in the market as a hackathon. We as the regulator just decided that hacking things wasn't really on brand, so we call it a Techsprint. But basically it is a sort of collective, quite intensive problem-solving activity, which runs over a number of days. In this instance, we were looking at AML, financial crime, and specifically looking at how we could leverage privacy-enhancing technologies to better solve for that. And to your point in terms of sort of how financial crime works these days, it's a massively global operation. These are quite sophisticated operators who have quite sophisticated networks. And so really this is one of those cases where we have to meet fire with fire. There is a need for us to come together across different institutions, across different regulators, to actually solve for this problem as a unit. And that was the reason why this actually lends itself so nicely to something like a Techsprint.
And with AML, is it specifically the money laundering part of it, or was it sort of wider fraud activities, or knowing your customer, or was it specifically focused on money laundering?
So it did sort of cover off more broadly, so it worked sort of slightly differently. So I was based in DC, so I think the interesting thing to say here is we really meant what we said about it being a global tech sprint. For the first time ever, we actually had a satellite office running in the US in Washington, DC. Nice. We had AIR, the Alliance for Innovative Regulation, Joanne Barefoot and her team actually coordinating and running the event for us. But what we were looking to do is actually help the US regulatory community understand how these types of tools like the Techsprint can be leveraged in the fight against financial crime. And it was very much a case of learn by doing. This wasn't, we'll send you a nice PowerPoint presentation and you can get back to us with some questions. This was, guys, the best way for you to know is just to get on and run one. And actually then you come out the other side of it with a clear view on what the toolkit is, how you use it, what the value is in its application. But you've also started building out some of those networks across borders, and within the US. You have solutions that you could possibly continue working on that can make some difference in the market. So it was really nice to sort of be in that position to actually sort of witness that firsthand.
Nice. Yeah, and I think, I'm sorry, I've been a bit naughty because I was like, oh, is it money laundering or fraud? And then actually the reality is that I think the experience is financial crime is evolving fast, and it's all like, it's taking a holistic approach is the sensible thing. You need to know who the customer is, you need to know what the problem is. The crimes evolve quite rapidly, so the more people can share, the more effective that is. I guess on that point, what like opportunities do new technologies offer when it comes to detecting financial crime? What's the kind of most exciting thing that you see coming down the pipeline?
So in the UK, as I said, they were focused more specifically on privacy-enhancing technologies. The US had a bit of a broader mandate that was more akin to the smaller tech sprints that we started off with in the UK. But when you look at the privacy-enhancing technologies, things like zero-knowledge proof, homomorphic encryption, how they can be leveraged.
Two amazing phrases. What do they mean? Sorry.
So zero-knowledge proof is, I guess, the ability fundamentally to prove that you either have or know something without anyone actually knowing what that something is. So in a simple example, it could be the ability for you to log into a website without having shared your password.
Got you.
So how that can then be applied across entities to make sure that we are still working to data privacy laws and requirements. And then homomorphic encryption is quite a neat one. So I guess if you think about sort of data as a very kind of precious commodity, and I think that's something that we've all come to recognise over recent years, where do you put things when you want to kind of guard them and make sure they're okay? You might put them in a safe. And if we kind of consider the safe as kind of encrypting of that data, the nice thing about homomorphic encryption is it actually allows you to perform mathematical functions on the data whilst it's still in the safe. you don't have to take it out to use it as you would normally do, which is where, you know, potentially it's exposed and it's at risk, or actually because you're exposing it, you're not meeting your data privacy requirements. And again, when you're looking at connectivity between institutions, that's where a lot of things have stumbled to date. A lot of the analytics around sort of network analysis, dispersion analysis, have actually been able to work within, you know, a group of institutions or perhaps at a scheme level, but there is always a point where the trail goes cold because you get beyond the scope of what you can see. And this is actually looking at solutions that mean you could potentially see everything. So there were some solutions that were focused on this, sort of quite a few in both the UK and the US that were looking at how can we do that cross-institutional piece, how can we make sure that we're leveraging the power of the network rather than things staying siloed within different institutions, which is really cool.
In a data secure way where,
Absolutely,
awesome.
Absolutely.
Well, the next question on this list is who participated, because they must have been very smart.
So in terms of kind of who participates in a Techsprint, sort of talking most broadly, you would have sort of various individuals in the financial services arena that might act as sort of subject matter experts, developers, UX specialists. People will have different roles within the team. So yes, you will have your front end, your back end, your UX. You will have people that we call communicators who are basically there to do the pitch piece to make sure that when it gets to the end of the days and you're going into judging, you've got a really sort of tight, punchy narrative about what the use case is, why it's so impactful. And I mentioned the SMEs already, but we also tend to have sort of floating SMEs that can work with any of the teams that are present, just to sort of soundboard ideas, test things out. And how it will tend to work is we will form sort of teams outside of the Techsprint before it actually happens. And the reason we do that is because we want that sort of diversity of thought. We don't allow sort of whole organisations to come in wholesale and say we're team kind of, you know, organisation X. Nice. We segregate people to make sure we're sort of maximising the number of angles and viewpoints that people are coming at this at, because ultimately, you know, more diverse thinking leads to better solution development. So that's really key. We try and sort of connect the teams beforehand to make sure that they've gone through some of that sort of forming and storming, so they don't sort of, you know, run down the clock on the week itself.
Just making friends.
Making friends. But they can get into the task at hand. Nice. So they will pick up their use cases or design their use cases, and they will basically just start cracking into the solution design. And over the course of the week, we have people coming in to do observations, so quite a lot of people from the regulatory community, sort of C-suites, execs, to actually just see what's going on, because it's
see the magic.
Yeah, see the magic
everyone making
happen.
Friends.
Yes, and hopefully also building some great solutions. Yeah. So that's sort of happening, and then. As I say, the experts are sort of there to support and guide. What we actually had in London this year, which we didn't do in DC, is there was actually a bit of a challenge panel on the penultimate day to again give an early chance to pitch, get some sense check and feedback on how to fine tune the ideas. And then the final day you go into judging. So we had a selection of kind of keynotes. We had over 200 C-suite attendees. Wow. We obviously had all of the participants. So across both sites we had 10 teams in the UK, 5 teams in the US, which is around I think 160 participants from over 60 organisations. So it was a big operation. And yes, you go in, you'll be doing your pitching. The judges are there. I was judging in DC. Nice. You are kept on your toes as much as the teams are, because it's just sort of, okay, few minutes, move on to the next, few minutes, move on to the next. And you look to sort of score them based on, practicality of the situation, the solution, potential time to market, how much of a leap this is it just a sort of bit of an iteration on things we've seen before, or actually is this a sort of fundamental shift? So it's a really special experience, really, really exciting.
How many judges are there?
So in the US, I think there were 5 of us. And to be honest, David will know on the UK off the top of his head. But there's a small panel, and again, it's to make sure you've got kind of a diversity of kind of attendees. So we had people from industry, we had other regulators, to try and make sure we had as much sort of a rounded view on how people felt the solutions could perform as possible.
Awesome. I think we're approaching the end of the time, but that sounds absolutely amazing, and like a seriously interesting week. So just quickly before we go, if people want to get involved with the cross-sector sandbox, can you just recap how they do that?
Yes, absolutely. So you can go online, you can search for the cross-sector sandbox call for input. You will find the summary information there. Alternatively, if you think you've heard enough about the idea and you just want to put finger to keyboard, the email address again is crosssectorsandbox@fca.org.uk. And
we will make sure we find a way to push that out.
Yeah, that would be great.
And lastly, what's up next for you and the FCA?
What's up for us next in the FCA?
Broad question.
Broad question. Many things. So we're obviously sort of continuing to do work with our partners in the Global Financial Innovation Network. So this was our sort of first year of chairing. We will get to a point where we will be looking at...
Who are the members of that? Just because you mentioned a couple of times. I mean, obviously the US, and the UK, EU?
So the US aren't as yet in the Global Financial Innovation Network. We were just working with them on the Techsprint. But we have various global regulators. We have MAS, HKMA, ASIC. We do have some European regulators in Guernsey, in Jersey, in Luxembourg. Nice. So there's a real broad spread. We started off again with sort of a handful of people who wanted to sort of come along the journey to see what we would make of it, and we're nearly at 40 organisations now. Cool. Who are part of GFIN. So that's going to be taking up a fair bit of our time.
I bet. And all of these financial crime problems and customer problems are international, increasingly so. So the more we can work that way, the better. It's got to be a good option.
Yeah, and from our perspective, we are really interested in sort of how we can expand this more broadly. So I think anyone who's not a member so far, we would be very much open to a conversation, and just to see how we can make sure we're doing our utmost to tackle some of these fundamental problems, and make the most of some of the opportunities that are coming down the track as well.
Awesome. Okay, that's all we have time for this week. How can people find out more about you, Samantha? Or where can people find out more about you? Sorry.
So the best place to go is going to be LinkedIn. So just search for me, Samantha Emery. I will be obviously down as working at the FCA if there are many other Samantha Emerys, but that's the best place to find me.
I googled you earlier, and FCA appears first. So
there we go.
Whoever the other Samantha Emerys are, they're not worth caring about. And you can find me at Will White 11OS. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much. If you want more insights like this, but you don't want to see my face, great. Why not listen to the FinTech Insider podcast, which is fair. I've got a face for radio. It's available on all your favourite podcast providers. If you want this topic discussed on air, well, hit us up on those emails, or just tweet us at FinTech Insiders. See you next week. Bye for now.
Bye.